In 1974, a 12-year-old boy named Danny Rowland lived with his parents in a small house in Memphis, Tennessee. His father worked at a printing company. His mother stayed home to look after Danny and his younger sister. They were not a wealthy family, but they had enough. They had a routine, they had plans. Then, in the spring of that year, everything changed. Danny had been complaining about headaches for several weeks. At first, his parents thought it was nothing serious. Kids get headaches. He was growing, he was active, and the school year was winding down. His mother gave him aspirin and told him to rest. But the headaches kept coming. They got worse at night. Danny started waking up in the middle of the night holding his head, and no amount of rest made them go away. His parents took him to their family doctor in late April. The doctor ran some basic tests and referred them to a specialist at a hospital in Memphis. That referral was the first sign that something was seriously wrong. Family doctors do not send 12-year-old boys to specialists for ordinary headaches. The specialist ordered a series of tests over the following 2 weeks. During that time, Danny continued going to school. He sat through his classes, came home, did his homework, and tried to act like everything was normal. His parents did the same. They went to work, made dinner, and did not talk about the tests in front of the children. But at night, after Danny and his sister were in bed, they talked about it quietly in the kitchen, going over the same questions with no answers. The results came back in May. Danny had a brain tumor. It was located in a part of the brain that made surgery extremely difficult. The doctors explained the situation carefully and honestly. The tumor was growing. The options were limited. Radiation treatment could slow things down, but it could not stop what was happening. Based on everything they were seeing, the doctors told Danny's parents that their son had approximately 6 months to live. Danny's father later said that the drive home from the hospital that day was the longest of his life. He and his wife did not speak. There was nothing to say that made any sense. They had walked into that office as the parents of a healthy boy with headaches, and they walked out carrying information that most people never have to carry. They told Danny the truth. They did not hide it from him or soften it beyond recognition. He was 12, not 6. He understood more than they sometimes gave him credit for. They sat with him in the living room one evening and explained what the doctors had said. Danny listened. He asked a few questions. Then he was quiet for a long time. His parents sat with him until he was ready to go to bed. What followed was a strange kind of adjustment. The family continued living their daily life, but everything had a different weight now. Danny still went to school when he felt well enough. His classmates mostly did not know what was happening. His teachers had been informed, but they were told to treat him normally, and most of them tried. Danny appreciated that. He did not want to be looked at differently. But the headaches were getting harder to manage. Some mornings he could not get out of bed. The medication he was on made him tired and sometimes nauseous. He lost weight through May and June. The boy who had been running around the neighborhood 6 months earlier was now spending more afternoons on the couch than outside. His mother kept a notebook during this period. She wrote down his symptoms, his medication schedule, his good days and his bad days. She wrote down the names of every doctor they spoke to and every option they were told about. She was trying to stay in control of something that was completely out of her control. Danny's father had heard about organizations that helped sick children meet people they admired. He had heard that some celebrities made time for kids in situations like Danny's. He did not know how any of it worked, or whether it was something that actually happened or just something people talked about. But he started asking around. He spoke to a nurse at the hospital. He made a few phone calls. Danny had been an Elvis fan since he was 7 or 8 years old. He had Elvis records, he had a poster on his wall. He had watched Elvis on television and talked about him the way kids talk about someone they genuinely admire. His father remembered that when he started thinking about who to reach out to. He wrote a letter. He did not expect much, but he sent it. How he got to Elvis. Danny's father, Robert Rowland, was not the kind of man who wrote letters to celebrities. He had never done anything like it before. He was a practical person who believed in handling things himself and not asking others for help unless there was no other option. But this was different. His son was dying, and if there was any chance that a letter could give Danny something to hold on to, Robert was going to write it. He sat at the kitchen table one evening in late June and wrote the letter by hand. He did not ask Elvis for money. He did not ask for miracles. He explained who Danny was, what he was going through, and what Elvis meant to the boy. He wrote that Danny had been a fan since he was young, that he had Elvis records and a poster on his wall, and that meeting Elvis even briefly would mean more to his son than he could properly explain in a letter. He kept it simple and honest. He sealed it, addressed it to Elvis Presley at Graceland in Memphis, and mailed it the next morning. He told almost no one that he had done it. He mentioned it to his wife, but he did not tell Danny. He did not want to build up an expectation that might go nowhere. Most letters sent to famous people never get read. Robert understood that. He sent it anyway and tried to put it out of his mind. What Robert did not fully know at the time was that Elvis had a specific group of people around him whose job included managing the enormous volume of mail that came into Graceland. Elvis received thousands of letters every week from fans across the country and around the world. Most of them were handled by staff and never reached Elvis directly. But there was a process in place for certain kinds of letters. Letters from sick children, letters from people in genuine distress, letters that stood out from the standard fan mail. These were sometimes set aside and brought to Elvis's attention personally. Joe Esposito, who was one of Elvis's closest associates and had worked with him for years, later spoke about this process in interviews. He said that Elvis took those kinds of letters seriously. He said that Elvis would sometimes read them himself, and that when something moved him, he acted on it. Esposito described Elvis as someone who genuinely could not read about a child suffering and do nothing. It was not performance. It was simply how Elvis was built. Robert's letter was passed up the chain. Sometime in July, approximately 3 weeks after Robert mailed it, the phone rang at the Rowland house. The woman on the other end identified herself as calling from Graceland on behalf of Elvis Presley. She asked to speak with Robert Rowland. Robert later said his first thought was that someone was playing a prank. He asked her to repeat who she was calling from. She did. Then she explained that Elvis had read the letter about Danny and wanted to arrange a meeting. Robert sat down. He called his wife into the kitchen. He asked the woman to hold for a moment. His wife stood in the doorway looking at him, and he told her quietly what was happening. She put her hand over her mouth. Then Robert got back on the phone and said yes. The arrangements were made over the following week. Danny would be brought to Graceland on a Saturday afternoon in late July. The visit would be kept private. There would be no press, no photographers, no public announcement. Elvis's staff was clear about that from the beginning. This was not a publicity event. It was a private visit, and it would stay that way. Danny was told about it on a Tuesday evening. His parents sat with him in the living room, the same place where they had told him about his diagnosis, and this time they had something different to say. His mother told him that they had been in contact with Graceland and that Elvis wanted to meet him. Danny looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he asked if she was serious. She told him she was. He looked at his father, who nodded. Danny did not jump up or shout. He was not feeling well enough for that. But he smiled. His father later said it was the first real smile he had seen on his son's face in 2 months. The following Saturday, Robert helped Danny get dressed, and the family drove to Graceland. Graceland on a Saturday afternoon in late July was quieter than most people would have expected. There were fans gathered at the gate on Elvis Presley Boulevard, as there almost always were, but inside the property it was calm. The Rowland family arrived in the early afternoon. Robert parked the car, and he and his wife walked with Danny up toward the house. Danny was moving slowly that day. The medication and the illness had taken a toll on his energy, and the heat of a Memphis summer did not help. But he was there. He was dressed in his good clothes, and he was there. A member of Elvis's staff met them at the door and brought them inside. The interior of Graceland was not what most people imagined when they pictured a mansion. It was large, but it felt lived in. There were personal touches everywhere. It was a home, not a showpiece. Danny looked around quietly as they were led through. His mother kept her hand on his shoulder. They were brought into one of the sitting rooms and asked to wait. Someone brought them cold drinks. The staff member who had let them in checked on them once and told them Elvis would be with them shortly. Robert later said that the 10 minutes they waited in that room felt much longer than 10 minutes. He was watching Danny, who was sitting upright on the couch, looking at everything around him with the kind of focused attention that kids have when they are trying to memorize something. Then, Elvis walked in. He was not in a stage costume. He was not dressed the way he appeared in photographs or on television. He was wearing casual clothes, and he looked relaxed. He walked directly over to Danny, crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy, and shook his hand. He introduced himself by his first name, as if Danny might not know who he was. Danny later told his mother that was the part he remembered most clearly. Elvis did not walk in like a famous person. He walked in like someone who was there to spend time with a kid. Elvis sat down across from Danny and started talking. He asked Danny about himself. He asked what grade he was in, what subjects he liked, whether he played any sports. He asked about his sister. He asked what Danny's favorite Elvis song was, and when Danny told him, Elvis nodded and said, "That was a good one." The conversation moved naturally. Elvis did not treat Danny like a sick child. He treated him like a person he was genuinely interested in getting to know. Robert and his wife sat nearby and mostly listened. Robert later said he had walked into that room prepared to feel grateful, but what he actually felt was something closer to relief. He had been watching his son shrink over the previous months, not just physically, but in some harder-to-define way. The illness had made Danny quieter, more withdrawn. But sitting in that room talking to Elvis, Danny was present in a way he had not been in a long time. At some point, the conversation turned to music. Elvis asked Danny whether he played any instruments. Danny said he had tried to learn guitar, but had not gotten very far. Elvis smiled at that and said most people did not get very far at first. He talked a little about learning to play himself, about the early years, about how much practice it actually took. He was not lecturing, he was just talking, the way someone talks when they are sharing something they know well. Elvis spent close to an hour with the family. At one point, he excused himself briefly and left the room. When he came back, he was carrying a few items, some signed photographs, a record. He gave them to Danny personally. He also sat back down and continued talking rather than using the gifts as a natural endpoint to the visit, which would have been easy to do. Before the family left, Elvis spoke quietly with Robert for a few minutes while Danny sat with his mother. Robert did not share the full details of that conversation publicly for many years. What he did say was that Elvis asked specific questions about Danny's medical situation. He asked which doctors the family was working with. He asked whether they had explored all the options available to them. He asked in the way someone asks when they are not just making conversation. Robert answered honestly. He explained the situation as the doctors had laid it out. Elvis listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he told Robert he wanted to make some calls. Robert Rowland did not fully understand what Elvis meant in that moment. When Elvis said he wanted to make some calls, Robert took it as a kind expression of concern. Famous people sometimes said things like that. They meant well, and then life moved on and nothing came of it. Robert thanked him, shook his hand, and the family drove home. Danny fell asleep in the back seat before they had cleared the neighborhood. It had been a big day, and the energy had taken out of him was visible. But Elvis was not making conversation when he said he wanted to make calls. He meant it in the most direct sense possible. Before the Rowland family had been home for 2 hours, Elvis was already on the phone. The people closest to Elvis during that period of his life were consistent about one thing when they spoke about him in later years. When Elvis decided to do something, he did not wait. He did not hand it off to someone else to look into and report back. He picked up the phone himself. Joe Esposito, who was present at Graceland that day, later described Elvis's response to the Rowland visit as immediate. He said Elvis came back into the room after the family left, sat down, and started making calls within the hour. The first call Elvis made was to a doctor he knew personally. Elvis had connections in the medical community that most people were not aware of. His own complicated relationship with medicine and physicians was well documented. But alongside that, he genuinely knew people in the field. He had spent enough time in Memphis hospitals over the years.
whether for his own reasons or visiting others, that he had built real relationships with certain doctors. He called one of those doctors and explained Danny's situation. He gave the name of the hospital the family was using, the diagnosis as Robert had described it, and asked directly whether there was anything that could be done that was not being done. That first call led to a second call. The doctor Elvis reached out to had a colleague who specialized specifically in the type of tumor Danny had been diagnosed with. This specialist was based in Houston, Texas, at a medical center that was considered one of the leading institutions in the country for that kind of case. Elvis asked for the name and number. Then he called the specialist directly. Getting through to a specialist of that level was not straightforward for most people. Waiting lists were long. Referrals took time. The process of moving a case from one hospital to another involved paperwork, insurance questions, and institutional layers that could take weeks or months to work through. Elvis did not go through those layers. He called the specialist's office, identified himself, and asked to speak with the doctor. He got through. The conversation Elvis had with that specialist lasted approximately 20 minutes, according to people who were aware of it at the time. Elvis described Danny's case in the detail that Robert had given him. He asked the specialist whether he would be willing to review Danny's file and examine him in person. He asked what it would take to make that happen quickly. The specialist agreed to review the case. He asked for the medical records to be sent to his office in Houston. Elvis then made a third call. This one was to someone in his personal circle who handled financial matters and logistics. Elvis was not calling to ask for permission or to have someone look into costs. He was calling to arrange payment. Whatever it cost to get Danny to Houston, to have him seen by the specialist, and to cover whatever followed, Elvis was covering it. He did not make this known to the Rowland family through a formal announcement. He simply arranged it and made sure the right people knew what was needed. By the time the calls were finished that evening, a process had been set in motion that the Rowland family had no idea was happening. They were at home in their small house in Memphis. Danny was resting. His parents were sitting in the kitchen, processing the day, talking about what it had meant to meet Elvis, feeling grateful for the visit and the signed photographs and the hour of kindness their son had received. They thought the day was over. It was not over. While they were sitting in that kitchen, the phone at the specialist's office in Houston had already rung. A file request was already being prepared. An arrangement was already being made. The following morning, the phone rang at the Rowland house.
The call came at 9:30 on a Sunday morning. Robert Rowland was in the kitchen making coffee. His wife was getting Danny's medication ready for the day. When the phone rang, Robert picked it up without much thought. Weekend calls were usually family. The woman on the other end introduced herself as calling from Graceland. She told Robert that Elvis had been in contact with a specialist in Houston, Texas, and that arrangements were being made to have Danny seen at that facility. She gave Robert the name of the doctor and the name of the medical center. She told him that Danny's medical records needed to be released and sent to Houston, and she explained exactly how to authorize that. She also told him that all costs associated with the consultation, the travel, and any treatment that followed would be taken care of. She said this plainly, without making it into a larger moment than it was, as if she were reading from a practical checklist, which she probably was. Robert stood in the kitchen holding the phone and did not say anything for a moment. His wife looked at him from across the room. He held up a hand to let her know he was still listening. The woman on the phone asked if he had any questions. Robert said he had several, and she answered each one. By the time the call ended, he had the name of the specialist, the name of the medical center, the steps he needed to take to release Danny's records, and the name of a contact at Graceland he could reach if anything came up. He put the phone down and stood there for a moment. Then he told his wife what had happened. The first practical step was the medical records. Robert called Danny's hospital in Memphis that Monday morning and began the process of authorizing the release of Danny's file to the specialist in Houston. The hospital's records department walked him through the paperwork. It took 2 days to complete. By Wednesday of that week, Danny's full medical file had been transferred. The specialist in Houston reviewed the file within days of receiving it. This was not the standard timeline. Cases referred through normal channels could sit in a review queue for weeks, but this case had been flagged, and the specialist moved through it quickly. By the end of that week, his office called the Rowland house directly to schedule an in-person consultation. They offered a date the following week. Robert accepted it. The travel arrangements were handled through Graceland's contact. Robert had expected to drive or find the cheapest available flights. Instead, the contact called him with details already worked out. Flights from Memphis to Houston had been booked for Robert, his wife, and Danny. A car would meet them at the airport. A hotel near the medical center had been arranged for the duration of the visit. Robert did not book any of it himself and was not asked to pay for any of it. Every time he tried to raise the question of cost, the contact told him it was handled and moved on to the next practical detail. Danny was told about the Houston trip on a Thursday evening. His parents explained that Elvis had arranged for him to be seen by a different doctor, a specialist who knew a great deal about Danny's specific condition. Danny asked if this meant something might be different from what the Memphis doctors had said. His parents were careful with their answer. They told him it meant they were going to get another opinion from someone who dealt with cases like his every day, and that it was worth making the trip to find out what he had to say. Danny nodded. He asked if he could bring his Elvis record on the plane. His mother told him he could bring whatever he wanted. They flew to Houston the following Tuesday. The medical center was larger than the hospital Danny was used to in Memphis. The staff there had clearly been briefed on the case before the family arrived. They were taken through registration quickly and brought to the specialist department without a long wait. The specialist himself came out to meet them in the waiting area rather than having a nurse call them back, which Robert noticed and appreciated. The consultation lasted most of the morning. The specialist examined Danny thoroughly and asked detailed questions that the Memphis doctors had not asked, or had not asked in the same way. He ordered a new set of scans using equipment that the Memphis hospital did not have. He told the family he wanted to review everything before drawing any conclusions, and asked them to come back the following morning. That evening, the three of them sat in the hotel room and had dinner together. Danny watched television and fell asleep early. Robert and his wife sat by the window, looking out at a city they had never been to before, waiting for a morning that felt like it carried more weight than most.
The specialist called the family back into his office the following morning. He had the new scans on the wall and Danny's full file open on his desk. He spent time going through what he had found before he said anything conclusive. Robert and his wife sat across from him, while Danny waited in an adjoining room with a nurse. The specialist had suggested that arrangement, and the Rowlands had agreed. Some conversations needed to happen between adults first. What the specialist told them was not a simple reversal of everything the Memphis doctors had said. He did not tell them that Danny was going to be fine. Medicine does not usually work that way, and this specialist was not the kind of doctor who offered comfort that was not supported by evidence. But what he did tell them was significant. He said that based on the new scans and his review of the full file, there was a treatment approach that had not been tried. It was not available in Memphis. It was available at his facility in Houston. It was not a guarantee, but it was a real option, and in his professional assessment, it was worth pursuing. Robert asked them directly what the realistic outcome could look like if they proceeded. The specialist gave him an honest answer. He said that in cases similar to Danny's where this approach had been used, some patients had seen meaningful extensions of their time. Not cures, extensions, more months. In some cases, considerably more. He said Danny's age and overall physical condition, outside of the tumor, made him a reasonable candidate. He recommended they begin as soon as the family was ready. Robert looked at his wife. She had been holding herself together through the entire conversation with the focused stillness of someone who had decided in advance that she was not going to fall apart in a doctor's office. She nodded at Robert. He turned back to the specialist and told them they were ready. They brought Danny back into the room and told him what had been decided. The specialist explained it to Danny directly, in language a 12-year-old could follow, which Robert appreciated. Danny listened carefully. He asked one question, which was whether it was going to hurt. The specialist told him honestly that some parts of it would be uncomfortable, but that they would manage it as carefully as they could. Danny thought about that for a moment and then said that was okay. The family flew back to Memphis 2 days later with a treatment plan, a schedule, and a return date to Houston. The logistical reality of what came next was significant. Danny would need to be in Houston for extended periods. Robert would need to take time away from work. His wife would need to arrange care for Danny's younger sister. The financial weight of all of it under normal circumstances would have been crushing, but the arrangements Elvis had put in place extended beyond the initial consultation. The contact at Graceland had already been in communication with the medical center. The costs of treatment were being covered. Travel back and forth was being handled. The family did not have to figure out the money while also trying to keep their son alive. Robert later said that this was the part that was hardest to fully accept. Not the visit, not the phone calls, not even the specialist. The part that was hardest to take in was sustained, practical, ongoing support that removed the financial obstacle entirely at the moment when it would have been most devastating. He said that he and his wife had spent weeks calculating what they could sell, what they could borrow, and how much debt they were willing to take on for Danny's treatment. All of that calculating became unnecessary overnight. He wrote a letter to Elvis after they returned from Houston. He sat at the same kitchen table where he had written the first letter, and he tried to explain what had happened and what it meant. He said later that the second letter was much harder to write than the first. The first letter had been a request from a desperate father. The second letter was an attempt to express something for which he could not find adequate words. He wrote several drafts. He was not sure any of them said what he actually meant. He sent one anyway. He received a short response from Graceland a week later. It was not written by Elvis personally, but it conveyed that Elvis was glad the family had gotten to Houston and that he hoped Danny's treatment went well. It was brief and practical, which somehow made it feel more genuine rather than less. The family returned to Houston the following month to begin treatment. Danny carried his Elvis record in his bag. Danny began treatment in Houston in September of 1974. The process was demanding from the first week. The approach the specialist had recommended was more intensive than anything Danny had gone through in Memphis, and the side effects were harder to manage. He was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. Some days he could not eat. Some days the nausea was bad enough that he spent most of the morning in bed. His mother stayed with him in Houston during the treatment periods, while Robert went back to Memphis to work and look after Danny's sister, driving down on weekends when he could. The medical center had a small area where families staying for extended treatment could spend time together outside of the clinical environment. Danny spent time there on his better days. There were other children going through treatment at the same facility, and Danny, who had become quieter over the months of his illness, gradually started talking to some of them. His mother noticed this and was glad for it. It was good for him to be around other kids who understood what it felt like, because they did not need things explained, and they did not look at him the way people at home sometimes did. By November, the specialist ordered a new set of scans to measure how the tumor was responding. The family waited several days for the results. Robert drove down from Memphis, and the three of them sat together in the waiting area when the specialist came out to talk to them. He told them that the tumor had not grown. In fact, in one area, it appeared slightly smaller. He was careful about how he framed it. He told them this was a meaningful result, but that it was one data point, and they needed to continue and monitor closely. He did not tell them Danny was going to be fine, but he told them the treatment was doing something, and that was more than they had been given before. Robert later said that he walked out of that building and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could drive. He did not cry inside. He waited until he was alone in the car. Danny continued treatment through the winter. Christmas of 1974 was spent partly in Memphis and partly in Houston. The family kept it as normal as they could. Danny's sister had been told enough to understand that her brother was sick and that he was getting help, and she had adjusted to the changed shape of family life with the resilience that younger children sometimes show when they have no alternative. She made Danny a card for Christmas that he kept on the table next to his bed in the Houston accommodation. The treatment continued into 1975. The scans in January showed continued stability. The specialist began talking about the possibility of a longer timeline than the original prognosis had suggested. He still would not use the word cure. He was honest that they were in territory where outcomes were genuinely uncertain. But he said that Danny was responding better than the initial data had given them reason to hope. Danny turned 13 in the spring of 1975. His parents organized a small party at their house in Memphis during one of the periods when he was home between treatment cycles. Some of his school friends came. His mother made the food he asked for. He was thin and tired, and his hair had thinned from the treatment, but he sat at the table and opened his presents and ate cake and talked with his friends, and for a few hours the house felt the way it used to feel. He lived past the 6 month he had originally been given. He lived past the end of 1974. He lived through 1975. The treatment continued to show results, and the specialist's cautious optimism gradually became something more concrete. By mid-1975, the language being used in Danny's medical consultations had shifted. The tumor had reduced further. The immediate threat that had defined the previous year was no longer the same threat it had been. Danny did not make a full recovery in the way that term is sometimes used. The illness left marks. There were lasting effects from both the tumor and the treatment that he carried with him into adolescence and beyond. But he was alive. He went back to school. He grew up. He became a young man, and then an adult, in a future that a doctor in Memphis had told his parents he was not going to have. Robert always said the same thing when people asked him how to explain it. He said a man picked up a phone, and his son got to live his life. Danny began treatment in Houston in September of 1974. The process was demanding from the first week. The approach the specialist had recommended was more intensive than anything Danny had gone through in Memphis, and the side effects were harder to manage. He was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. Some days he could not eat. Some days the nausea was bad enough that he spent most of the morning in bed. His mother stayed with him in Houston during the treatment periods, while Robert went back to Memphis to work and look after Danny's sister, driving down on weekends when he could. The medical center had a small area where families staying for extended treatment could spend time together outside of the clinical environment. Danny spent time there on his better days. There were other children going through treatment at the same facility, and Danny, who had become quieter over the months of his illness, gradually started talking to some of them. His mother noticed this and was glad for it. It was good for him to be around other kids who understood what it felt like, because they did not need things explained, and they did not look at him the way people at home sometimes did. By November, the specialist ordered a new set of scans to measure how the tumor was responding. The family waited several days for the results. Robert drove down from Memphis, and the three of them sat together in the waiting area when the specialist came out to talk to them. He told them that the tumor had not grown. In fact, in one area, it appeared slightly smaller. He was careful about how he framed it. He told them this was a meaningful result, but that it was one data point, and they needed to continue and monitor closely. He did not tell them Danny was going to be fine, but he told them the treatment was doing something, and that was more than they had been given before. Robert later said that he walked out of that building and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could drive. He did not cry inside. He waited until he was alone in the car. Danny continued treatment through the winter. Christmas of 1974 was spent partly in Memphis and partly in Houston. The family kept it as normal as they could. Danny's sister had been told enough to understand that her brother was sick and that he was getting help, and she had adjusted to the changed shape of family life with the resilience that younger children sometimes show when they have no alternative. She made Danny a card for Christmas that he kept on the table next to his bed in the Houston accommodation. The treatment continued into 1975. The scans in January showed continued stability. The specialist began talking about the possibility of a longer timeline than the original prognosis had suggested. He still would not use the word cure. He was honest that they were in territory where outcomes were genuinely uncertain. But he said that Danny was responding better than the initial data had given them reason to hope. Danny turned 13 in the spring of 1975. His parents organized a small party at their house in Memphis during one of the periods when he was home between treatment cycles. Some of his school friends came. His mother made the food he asked for. He was thin and tired, and his hair had thinned from the treatment, but he sat at the table and opened his presents and ate cake and talked with his friends, and for a few hours the house felt the way it used to feel. He lived past the 6 month he had originally been given. He lived past the end of 1974. He lived through 1975. The treatment continued to show results, and the specialist's cautious optimism gradually became something more concrete. By mid-1975, the language being used in Danny's medical consultations had shifted. The tumor had reduced further. The immediate threat that had defined the previous year was no longer the same threat it had been. Danny did not make a full recovery in the way that term is sometimes used. The illness left marks. There were lasting effects from both the tumor and the treatment that he carried with him into adolescence and beyond. But he was alive. He went back to school, he grew up, he became a young man, and then an adult, in a future that a doctor in Memphis had told his parents he was not going to have. Robert always said the same thing when people asked him how to explain it. He said a man picked up a phone, and his son got to live his life. Robert Rowland spoke publicly about Danny's story for the first time in 1987, 10 years after Elvis had died. He gave a short interview to a local Memphis publication that was running a piece on Elvis's legacy in the community. Robert had not sought out the interview. A journalist had heard the story through a mutual contact and reached out to ask if Robert would be willing to talk. He agreed, but he kept it brief. He confirmed the basic facts, said what Elvis had done, and did not add anything unnecessary. He was not interested in making it into something larger than it was. He said Elvis helped his family when they had nowhere else to turn, and that his son was alive because of it. And that was the whole story. But the story did not stay small. Over the following years, as more accounts of Elvis's private generosity began to surface, Danny's story became one of several that painted a picture of a man whose public image had never fully captured who he actually was in private. The concerts, the costumes, the records, the fame, all of that was real. But alongside it was something quieter that most people never saw, and that Elvis made no effort to publicize. People who worked closely with Elvis for years were consistent on this point. They described the man who responded to human need in a direct and personal way, not through a foundation or a publicist or a formal charity structure, but through phone calls he made himself, checks he wrote personally, and arrangements he put in place without telling anyone outside of the small circle needed to make them happen. Elvis did not want credit for these things. In several accounts from people in his inner circle, he specifically asked that what he had done not be discussed. He was not building a reputation for generosity. He was just doing what he felt he needed to do. The question of why Elvis was this way does not have a single clean answer, but the people who knew him best pointed to a few consistent things. The first was where he came from. Elvis grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, in genuine poverty. His family had very little. There were periods in his childhood when having enough food and keeping the lights on were real concerns, not abstract ones. He knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a problem that money could solve. When he had money, that memory did not leave him. It informed how he responded when he saw other people in the same position. The second thing people pointed to was his faith. Elvis was a serious and lifelong reader of religious and spiritual texts. He carried books with him constantly. He talked about faith, about service, about what a person owed to others with a regularity that surprised people who expected a rock and roll star to have different preoccupations. His generosity was not separate from his faith. For Elvis, they were connected. Helping someone who had no other options was not a choice he weighed up. It was something closer to an obligation he had accepted. The third thing was simpler. Elvis liked people. He was genuinely interested in the individuals he met, not in the abstract idea of helping people, but in specific people with specific problems. Danny Rowland was not a cause to Elvis. He was a 12-year-old boy who liked his music and was running out of time. Elvis responded to the specific reality of that, not to a general principle. What made Elvis unusual was not just that he was generous, but that his generosity operated completely outside of public view. In an era before social media, when there were fewer mechanisms for celebrities to convert acts of kindness into public relations material, some still found ways to make their giving visible. Elvis did the opposite. He went out of his way to keep it private. The people he helped were often ordinary individuals with no platform and no way to amplify what had happened to them. He was not selecting people who would tell the story well. He was helping people who needed help. Danny Rowland grew up, built a life, and carried the knowledge of what Elvis had done for his family with him for the rest of his life. His father, Robert, passed away in 2002. Before he died, Robert said in a final interview on the subject that he had thought about that Saturday afternoon at Graceland almost every day for nearly 30 years. He said the thing that stayed with him was not the specialist or the treatment or any of the practical things that followed. It was the moment when Elvis crouched down to shake his son's hand and spoke to Danny like he was the only person in the room. That was who Elvis was, not the version that filled arenas, the version that crouched down.